and welcome to episode 118 of the REconomy Podcast, our first episode of this year's summer school series, where we discuss economic issues that impact real estate, housing, and affordability. I am Odeta Kushi, Deputy Chief Economist at First American, and here with me is Mark Fleming, Chief Economist at First American. Hey, Mark, summer school is officially in session.
Summer school indeed. This is exciting. Our listeners, I'm sure, would be upset, though, if I did not mention that this reminds me of the classic 1987 movie named the same, Summer School. You know, Freddie Shoop, the Fabulous Thunderbirds. No?
I have no idea what you're talking about. You completely lost me.
I'll send you the
Okay.
I'll send you the links to it's a classic. But back to business. It's our second year of the REconomy Summer School, and the theme of this year's curriculum is going to be back to the basics.
That's right. The syllabus for the semester is centered around supply and demand. But before you zone out on us, the takeaway from the series will be that we are entering a brave new world of housing.
Ooh, an Aldous Huxley reference to get us started. Very, very nice. But I'm not sure if you meant that this might be promising or, Brave New World perilous.
So you'll just have to attend class to find out.
All summer long. Get it, listeners? Get it? I couldn't resist. But in all seriousness, I do think the housing market is headed towards change, and it all comes back to the fundamentals of supply and demand. Think back to a whole decade ago in 2015.
Wow, hard to believe that a decade ago is 2015. I mean, in my head, a decade ago is still the year 2000, and 2015 is just a few years ago. But okay, I'm joining you in 2015.
Okay, yes, I know. Time flies when you're having so much econ fun, right? Over this last decade. Well, back then, the housing market was on the cusp of a demographic transformation. I remember many were saying it would never happen. Millennials, the largest generation in U.S. history, they didn't want to become homeowners. We were saying, just wait for it. And of course, they did want to become homeowners. And as they aged into their prime home buying years, they drove demand for homes and put mounting pressure on supply. That dynamic was only accelerated by the global pandemic, which pulled forward even more demand and reshaped where people wanted to live.
Sure did. I mean, who can forget the double-digit price growth and bidding wars over the pandemic thanks to that supply and demand shock?
Exactly. But as we look ahead at the housing landscape, it's shifting again. Household formation in the next decade will be driven by changing generational dynamics again that will introduce new complexity to both housing supply and demand.
Well, that's actually a great segue to today's topic, which is all about the foundation of housing demand, household formation. Who forms households and when, and what even counts as a household?
So lesson 1, the foundation of demand. Let's get started with some definitions. In the housing world, we use the term headship rate, and it's a useful way to measure housing demand. Simply, the headship rate is the proportion of households relative to the total population.
And if you flip it around, the population divided by households is sort of like a proxy for household size. So a 49% headship rate means roughly 2 people per household, 1 divided by 0.49. But I digress. According to the Census Bureau official definition, the householder refers to the person or one of the people in whose name the housing unit is owned or rented. Or if there is no such person, any adult member excluding roomers, boarders, or paid employees. If the house is owned or rented jointly by a married couple, the householder may be either spouse. The person designated as the householder is the reference person to whom the relationship of all other household members, if any, is recorded.
And of course, if you are a student living at home with your parents, you are not considered your own household. Your parents are the head of household, or one of your parents is. If you move out and start renting your own place, even with roommates, you or one of your roommates becomes that rented household head. It's a way of translating population into actual housing demand because, of course, we don't need a housing unit for every person, but we would like enough housing units for every household.
That's right. And we should also note that group quarters are specifically excluded from the count of households. So college dorm rooms, for example, are not counted.
Great point. And now here's why all of this matters. If we just look at population growth, we might get an inflated or misleading sense of housing demand. A growing population doesn't automatically mean a growing number of households. What matters is how many people in that growing population are forming independent households.
That's where that headship rate comes in. It helps to translate how many actual households will need to house a population. based on how likely people in each age group are to form a household. And spoiler alert, it varies a lot by age and life stage.
Exactly. And a lot of things influence these headship rates. Demographics, sure, but also economics, marital rates, income, labor force participation, and even student debt. This is where household formation starts to intersect with some of the biggest social and economic trends.
Okay, so now that we have the definition out of the way and why it's so important, let's get to the numbers. According to our analysis of the current population survey's annual social and economic supplement, there were approximately 132 million households in the US in 2024. Now, this number will vary slightly depending on the data you're analyzing. There's different survey data out there trying to capture the number of households, but we're just going to go with that as our baseline for 2024. Now, the number of households is expected to grow by roughly 14 million between 2025 and 2045, depending on the assumptions about population and headship. We won't get into all of those assumptions in this episode, but we use the methodology provided by the Harvard Joint Center for Housing, and we will link that in the script.
And that's the key, of course. The assumptions are so important in generating these numbers.
Isn't it always with us economists? I mean, have you heard that joke about the physicist, the chemist, and the economist?
Of course, what economist hasn't? They were stranded on a desert island with no tools and a can of food. The physicist and the chemist each devised an ingenious mechanism for getting the can open, while the economist simply assumed that we have a can opener.
It's funny because it's true. We like to
It's
poke
so
fun at
true.
ourselves a little bit. But in this instance, those assumptions matter. And we can also play out different scenarios, but they all depend on how many people in each age group are expected to be household heads. That's how we estimate our projections, by applying projected headship rates to projected population by each age group. In other words, it's not just how many people there are, it's who they are, how old they are, and what stage of life they're in.
So, for example, younger households under the age of 25 have very low headship rates. They're in dorms, they've got roommates, or they're staying with their parents. The headship rate rises in the late 20s and 30s as people get jobs, move out, get married, and start families. And then it levels off or even declines at older age due to mortality or people moving in together for caregiving.
So, if you want to understand housing demand, you need to look at which age groups are growing. Right now, millennials and older Gen Zers are entering their prime household formation years, a high headship rate. That's one reason why we've seen strong demand post pandemic. According to our analysis, the headship rate for 25 to 34-year-old cohort increased from 43.5% in 2020 to 44.8% in 2024.
And that coincides with the millennial generation hitting their late 20s and early 30s. The pandemic accelerated this a bit too, but as people moved out of shared housing and into cities and formed their own households.
Now, according to the Joint Center for Housing Projections, the number of households in the US is expected to increase by 8.6 million, or approximately 860,000 per year between 2025 and 2035. So that's 8.6 million households over the next decade. This would be far less growth than in recent decades, including the slow 10 million households added over the decade in the wake of the Great Recession in the 2010s. The pace of growth is expected to slow between 2035 and 2045 to a gain of 5.1 million households. And that projected slowdown in household growth will be driven by slowing population growth as a result of rising mortality, fewer births among an aging population. Again, there are assumptions here that could very well change over time. Immigration, for one, could drive these numbers higher or lower.
Very true. And the Joint Center also estimates that the aging of the baby boomer generation will drive up the number of households headed by a person aged 80 or over by nearly 60% by 2035 and lead this group to nearly double in size by 2045. There will be a lot of over 80 headed households in 20
That's
years.
really interesting because that we would think would increase the demand for accessibility in that housing stock to really accommodate the needs of these 80 plus householders. So think more renovation projects so that this generation can comfortably age in place, which is actually a trend we've been seeing for some time.
That's a great point. And consider that a 2019 Freddie Mac study found that seniors born after 1931 are staying in their homes longer and aging in place. The result is higher home ownership rates for this group relative to previous cohorts. Freddie Mac estimates that this trend accounts for about 1.6 million houses held back from the market through 2018 because they stayed living in them instead of selling them. The pattern is explained by a few key factors such as better health and technology and wealth.
Meanwhile, the number of middle aged householders will rise with the millennial generation, increasing demand for housing options for families with kids. Recall that millennials are still aging into their 30s.
That's a good tailwind for housing demand and will likely increase the amount of turnover in the market, which is a little bit different, the number of households selling and buying, something we will discuss in the next summer school lesson. But an increase in the overall number of households, household growth, in other words, is projected to slow down over the next 2 decades.
Now, the Joint Center estimates that if we consider future demand for second homes and for replacement of homes demolished or otherwise removed from the housing stock, but not accounting for any additional housing to account for the current housing shortage, that's very important. And I want to dig into that for just 1 second. Then there will be a need for roughly 11 million new homes to be built between 2025 and 2035, slowing to 8 million new units needed between 2035 and 2045. As context, that's less than the approximately 10 million units built in the 2010s and the 17 million units built between 2000 and 2009. So essentially, we need to build less housing, but this is not accounting for the fact that we are currently facing a housing shortage. Those estimates vary, but the consensus shortage is around 3 million units. So, the number of new construction homes is likely higher than what I just mentioned once accounting for that existing shortage.
Yeah, those numbers are just to keep up with the new demand due to household formation, let alone to replace or recover from the lack of supply, given all the households that have already formed in the last few years.
That's right.
But those baby boomers that are in those homes will need work. Those homes, when they eventually come back to market, they will need more work. So the fixer-upper will definitely be popular again.
So there might be a shift away from construction of new homes to improvements of that existing stock. All right, I
That's right.
think this is a good time to stop for a little pop quiz.
Quizzes this early in summer school? Get no respite at all.
Nope.
Okay.
All right.
What's the question? Let me see if I can do
Okay,
this.
well, let's say the US population increased by 1 million. Does that mean that we need 1 million new homes?
Oh, softball. Not likely. Housing demand, as we said, equals population times the headship rate. And that's the housing demand of rented and owned households. And that's why headship is a more reliable predictor of future housing demand than population alone.
Okay,
Did I get it right?
100%. And it was a softball question. It's only class one. I don't want to scare away the students.
Just warming up.
Exactly. Now, that also helps to explain why demand sometimes surprises us. For example, if the economy improves and young adults feel more confident moving out, headship rates go up and housing demand rises faster.
That's right. Or vice versa. During the global financial crisis, a lot of young people delayed moving out. Headship rates fell and household formation stalled, even though population kept growing. That was the rise of boomerang kids moving back in with mom and dad, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and more failure to launch.
Wow, a 1986 and a 2006 movie reference? I'm impressed.
Since we've now had two 80s movies references, I figured I would give a shout out to you millennials.
Thank you. We do appreciate it. Now, I do want to cover one more thing that we've touched on throughout the episode, a few of the demographic drivers of headship. First up, marriage. Married people are more likely to form households, and married couples account for a large proportion of family households in the US. Millennials are getting married later in life compared with their generational predecessors, which was one reason why homeownership demand has been delayed for this group.
Then there's income and employment. If you're not earning enough to afford a separate place, you're not likely to move. You're more likely to live with your parents or roommates. When the labor market is strong, headship rates rise. For example, in 2020 and 2021, wage growth, government stimulus, the pause in student debt repayments all contributed to an unleashing of pent-up millennial household formation and demand for housing.
That's a great and timely example. And let's not forget housing supply. I mean, even if someone wants to form a household, they need a place to live. If there aren't enough homes or enough affordable homes, headship might lag.
That's right. Okay, so what's the main takeaway from today's first summer school lesson?
I think that would be that housing demand starts with household formation, and household formation starts with people making life transitions, jobs, relationships, independence.
Which reminds me of the immortal words of Simple Minds. Don't you forget about me. That's what the headship is saying to every housing model that forgets to include it.
Okay.
Did I do that well? Did I do it well?
Something like that. Now, two 80s movies references and one 80s song reference. Before it gets any worse, I think I hear the school
It's
bell
time.
ringing. That is class dismissed. Thank you all for joining us on the first REconomy Summer School session. If you have an economics-related question you'd like us to feature in the future, you can email us at economics@firstam.com. And as always, if you can't wait for the next episode, you can follow us on X. It's at Odeta Kushi for me and at mFlemingEcon for Mark. Until next time.